Well, welcome to the inaugural session of Boom with Bob on Friday, February the 25th. So obviously I'm Bob Westrop and joined by my two compadres here, actually both co-creators, co-founders of the Boom project. Um, Welcome to everybody. This is an informal, sometimes irreverent, um, always, hopefully, always interesting compliment to the podcast. Um, the uh, we've been asked to have an opportunity for people to um, interact with the guests from podcasts and to present just new ideas, have interesting people, and so we thought of using these streaming phenomena and to create our own live stream and use it as a way for interaction and discussion and elevation of the ideas that are important to Boom. And and truthfully, and really importantly, it's to get you to go back to the boombigideas.com website and look at the and listen to the podcasts that are there and to participate in the discussions that we want to get happening there. Something else I'm going to ask the folks to do, our listeners, is cut us some slack on this, our first episode. It's clearly something of an experiment. Live streaming is certainly new to me. And as you've seen, we've already had a few teachable moments and in sort of devising the technology solution, the free technology solution that allows us to do what we're doing. And this seems to be working because we have our first person in chat saying that they're here. So welcome, Rolf. And to Rolf's point, you should be able to identify yourselves using the YouTube chat feature on the right. And to ask questions, make any comments you want. And so that's kind of the housekeeping intro stuff. We're going to be talking with Mike Wittenstein, and so this would be a good time actually for introductions. And so I'm happy to blather about me, but it's really more about you. So Mike?
Sure. I am a former marketer, and in the podcast that we did together a few weeks ago, my title was "The Global Advertising Industry is at the Root of Trust Erosion." So I'm one of those marketing guys. I have been in my own business several times. I've worked for IBM. I've had some large company experience and, of course, worked on lots of client projects in about 20 something countries. So I hope I bring a good worldview to the table. Currently, I run a company called Story Miners based in Atlanta. It's a specialty management consultant company that helps leaders get their ideas clear and helps everyone understand them enough to buy in. I'm really excited to be here, and I can't wait until we start our conversation.
And I want to point out too that Mike is also the sponsor of our first sponsor of the podcast series. So thank you for all of that, Mike. And Stephen Hurley.
Well, thanks, Bob. It's good to be back here. Good to see you and good to be in the room with Mike. I'm Stephen Hurley, and I am a longtime educator, now retired, but someone who can't look away from the education space. It's where I've spent all of my life, including student and teacher and consultant and teacher educator. And part of that not looking away is starting Voice Ed Radio 5 years ago this month or last month. We began a space that was really trying to target polarization in conversations in education. And we grew from 3 podcasts in Canada related to education to live broadcasting and over 200 podcasters, creators, educators, and the like in our network. So I just love to listen to conversations. Someone's going to say, okay, Hurley, you get an honorary doctorate for all of the conversations that you've listened to in the past 5 years. And I'm waiting for that day to happen, but it's great to be here with both of you.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as Stephen pointed out when we got together just before the recording started, that this will make, 5.5 hours of live broadcasting for you today?
Yeah, I do a morning show, 5:30 to 9 Eastern every morning, live on your radio or wherever you listen. And yeah.
Cool. So at 1 o'clock, we're going to ask Mike to leave. And
kick him out.
Catarina von Maydell will be joining us to give her take on what agile leadership really means. And she believes, as I recall, that most of us use it inappropriately. And then to wrap it up, I'm going to share a few thoughts about what's going on in the Ukraine and the relevance of that to Boom. And that's about it. So we have, well, our audience has doubled, so we now have David Gruthrow here. So hopefully there's many more people who have not signed up or signed in. At any rate, this is being recorded and is our first experiment. So let's get to you, Mike. One thought I had is in terms of your hypothesis, which again, for the benefit of those who have not listened to it, to Rolf's question, trust erosion between who and who, all of that is addressed, Rolf, in Mike's excellent podcast on that very subject 2 weeks ago, but to which he is now going to share some further thoughts. So do you want to talk about your idea, and then we'll get to the challenge?
Sure. The idea is that we are almost blind to how much misinformation, untruths, and lying go on. I think we've been conditioned ever since we were little kids. And it seems like it's not okay for us as little kids to lie. Our parents tell us not to do that, but it's okay for our largest institutions, advertisers, governments, leaders of all kinds, to tell things that we know aren't true. We get it in the movies, we get it in advertising, we get it in telephone calls, we get it in emails, we get it everywhere, but somehow we're just not reacting to it strongly enough, in my opinion. So what Bob asked me to do as part of Boom is think on what would it take for us to make a big difference in 10 years? And what's the pressure point? Where can you apply a little bit of pressure to actually make some change? So what we thought about was reaching out to the associations behind marketing companies, strategy companies, and the like, and asking them to put I'll say pro-truth or truth-friendly principles into their own operating charters so that they would have to hold themselves to a higher standard of curating the truth, of valuing the truth, of using only truths, and for putting in consequences when people don't do that. It's been known for forever that truth creates more value and that lying destroys value, destroys trust. We're seeing it happen and unfold before our eyes as a new war in Ukraine is unfolding. Some of us are lucky enough to have vantage points that include the truths, the misinformation, and the untruths from a variety of different sides. Most people don't get that. They're subject to just one side or another because of their limited ability to hear different communications. So going back to the idea, it's to focus on the associations that serve the advertisers because they're the ones that control about $1 trillion in messaging every year that come to our ears all over the world. So if we could focus on them, they could focus on their members, the large brands, the ones that communicate in a huge, huge way. And most of these brands aren't egregious in terms of their use of misinformation or stating untruths. Most are not bad guys. But when you think about it, if large groups of brands can start only using truths in their messaging, in their communication, in their day-to-day, what kind of a precedent does that set for everybody else? Kind of moves the needle, moves the bar. We need to purposefully surround ourselves with a flood of truth. I personally believe, from having traveled almost 2 years overseas to 24 countries, I've lived abroad for about 1.75 years, besides individual trips and travel, that we are capable as a planet of people to figure out what's right. We just need the facts. There are no stupid people in the world. Well, there are, I'm sure there are a few, but the large groups of people that you meet, regardless of what you think of their cultures, have the same dispersion of intelligence, care and concern for family, interest in work, interest in friends that we all do. It's just, it's the nature of being human. There's no better and worse, I've found. So I believe that if we share more truth with people, they will just make better decisions. We just need millions and millions and millions of people making millions and millions of decisions based on what's right. It'll almost self-correct.
Yeah. One point, and Stephen, feel free to jump in whenever. But Rolf raises the question that, this has been a problem that's been around for a long time. I think one of the takeaways from our discussion, though, Mike, was that yes, it's been around. Lying's always been part of, all political culture. But technology has allowed for the weaponization of words, and the sort of the Madison Avenue phenomena of the 60s hyper accelerated that the manipulation of the word and the stretching of the truth so that, as I said, who actually trusted a car sales rep by the 1970s? It just, but at any rate, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Mike.
No, that's fine. It's a conversation, not a monologue.
Yeah.
Well, can I just jump? To Rolf's point, if you go back into advertising history, I think it was the 1920s where you're going to first come across a phrase like sold a bill of goods.
Mm-hmm.
Just a list of stuff instead of the actual product. So it's to what degree is modern advertising predicated and built on that foundation of, I don't want to say lying, but intentional deception?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, stretching things to kind of fit people's belief systems. Yeah.
And a lot of that is, if you imagine, it's like everything else. If you imagine the number of interactions somebody had in 1927, with their colleagues, whether they're a farmer or whether they're working in a city, but the number of interactions we had were just far less with each other. And the touch points with media, yes, you may have heard a Pepto-Bismol commercial on 1927 radio. I don't know how many times you would have heard it in the evening, but I don't know how many hours you were listening to radio a day and how many commercials you were exposed to. Whereas by the 60s or 70s, the bombardment had started on radio, television, and print, and just has become worse. It's just where everything to me is.
Well, Mike, when did marketing actually become a profession, a something that the soapbox salesman just didn't do because he had to sell soap?
I think I don't know the answer. Maybe somebody watching or now or later will be able to fill us in on that history. I think of the television show Mad Men that glorified the Madison Avenue advertising executives in the 60s. So by then it was already very established. They had figured out how to measure, address, control, but not in the sense of controlling people or media outlets, but just they had figured out the system and how to make it work. Back then, there were very, very few ways to communicate your message compared to now. There were 3 broadcast networks. There was no national daily newspaper other than the Wall Street Journal. And there were no podcasts. We wouldn't be having this meeting in the 1960s. So the thinking that was applied as I was taught in undergraduate and graduate school is to optimize the communication. And I think that's where the wolf got into, or whatever it is, that the fox got into the hen house, because what people were incented to do was maximize the efficiency of the advertising at all costs. Mm-hmm. So they started figuring out what would sell more product, as opposed to what would make customers happier, or what would make dogs healthier, or what would move more trash off the streets, or what would fill in your gap with whatever is of interest to you. So it was reduced to a very mechanistic way of making decisions about content and distribution and people. I have a member of our family who works in New York City and measures to the nth percentage point the difference between this person wearing a blue dress or a red dress, and all these different factors that just go into selling more. So we've got this consumptive economy. I don't know if marketers can do anything about it or not. There are some people that are more, conscious capitalism oriented, others that are, we're talking about, I'm starting to jump into politics here. The point that I'm trying to bring up is that we can choose to be mindful in a different way about our communications. We don't have to take the system that we have right now and fully ascribe to it. Who said that every single ad has to be optimized?
Google.
You're trying to save money. You're trying to make a profit. Yeah, you can do all of those things. And you can be conscious. You can be cautious. You can be caring in addition to that. So I think this idea of telling the truth is something that we need to push really hard. I was so proud of myself. Last night, I woke up about 3 a.m. and I had these thoughts about what to say on Boom Big Ideas, this podcast number 2 today. And this is going to sound weird, but Hillary Clinton was on the Today Show, and she said those words. Not exactly the words. I'm not as smart as Hillary Clinton, don't have the experience, but I felt so affirmed to be thinking along the same track, which was that we need to flood the world with good information. We think of the bad actors as the ones who are the problem, and we know that there are so few of them compared to the rest of us. And whatever side you're on, the other guys are the bad few, and you're part of the greater good. But it turns out that, what Hillary said, and I don't have a way of knowing, Bob, with your background, you may know, but in the case of Russia, for example, they've become very good at being bad actors and disrupting others. They're very good at getting their communications out, but they're probably not very good at stopping communications from getting in. That could be a weakness. Mm-hmm. Each one of us, Bob, what do you think there? You shook your head. Yes, no?
I don't know. I don't know that it takes away. It doesn't detract from your point. It's just the Russians are the grand masters at disinformation, and I'm not. Well, we're actually seeing right now with the protests that are happening in Russia that information is getting through. I mean, it's a lot harder for Russians to access the information we access, but it's not impossible, and clearly there are lots that do access Western media. And
I just think it would be so interesting if we, I don't know the hows of doing this. I do know a few people I could reach out to, but if we all pushed a little bit harder and made sure to share what's happening in the world, especially some of the Russian reactions that we've been able to see in media, and push those to the folks living in the country, could we not knock the stilts out from underneath this guy?
Yeah, one of the things I'll be talking about at the end of the show is just who our next guest that will be posting in the next week or two, or next week, I'm hoping, is a specialist on Russian disinformation. So,
maybe I'll hang around.
This is part of that. No, you're not allowed to, not after 1 o'clock. But it's. But I want to try and keep this conversation on, because all of these discussions are interconnected and they're all big discussions, and so it's how do we make these small, manageable discussions are still around big ideas. And for the benefit of the people who haven't had a chance to listen to the podcast yet, I mean, the point, sort of high level, was that marketers in the '60s, or the political marketing, has come from business marketing. I mean, almost all of the political marketers of the 80s, 90s, and aughts were people that cut their teeth in the advertising, or at least the business world, and they applied the skills they learned from it and the science that had evolved. And yes, while it's always been around, as in all things, the amplification of the different disciplines, in this case marketing, amplified by technology and just the evolution of society, meant that that they took, to me, pretty cynical lessons. The increase in the empirical, I mean, because it was empirical, it was obvious by the 80s or 90s that if you told the public this, you could get this kind of return. And the point we made in Mike's podcast was that every soap can't be number one, every soap can't be the best, and every car isn't what it was cracked up to be. And if we remember the problems I remember Ford had with rusty cars. I mean, I remember my father buying a car which basically you could watch dissolve on the driveway in real time. I mean, we've all had our interactions with car companies that. I'm a famous storyteller, so I won't get into my favorite ones, but where there's just clearly a disconnect between what they would probably admit as being more truthful, maybe not an absolute truth, but they would kind of admit, yeah, maybe our product does suck, but they never say that. And certainly when they're selling it to you, they never say that.
Yeah.
And two, I just have to say, what resonated personally with Mike's podcast was, I consider myself a marketer. I've spent my whole life selling stuff in the business world, and I often had a challenge with the balance between selling my product and being truthful. We need to change that.
Well, if this conversation and all these conversations are kind of nested, I think, and I don't know which is the primary part of the nesting doll, but they're all nested within one another. And if you're going to talk about selling, and you're going to link it to advertising, then you have to talk about folks like B.F. Skinner and his behaviorist thinking in terms of psychology and the rise of psychology and getting a handle on how humans are likely to react in certain situations. I mean, that's the foundation of modern marketing, I think, still. But I'm noticing in the spaces I travel in, and even in education, more and more individuals are being encouraged and coached into branding themselves, branding a human being. I mean, we brand cattle, but branding human beings. And that every time you brand yourself, you're presenting yourself in a way that may not be totally truthful. So if an educator writes a little 50-page book, that educator is now an author. If an educator is invited to do a TEDx talk, they're now a keynote speaker. So all of these things, there's truth to it, but they're not really an author. I would never call myself an author, but I could, because I've written some stuff. But it goes to the question that, in the chat there, about the subjectivity of truth, and how do we define truth, and what is not telling the truth? What does that mean in terms of that subjectivity? Because there are things that are kind of true. There are things that are true to me, but how do you separate that truth and opinion?
Yeah, and in some respects, what kind of got me on this track years ago was 10 years ago was when I took executive coaching. I took a degree at or a certificate at Royal Roads in executive coaching, and at the end of the course, we had branding people come in and talk about, well, now you need to all create your own brand.
Ugh.
And the attributes of that exercise were that we were all supposed to, think of our positioning, which is all fine and good, and differentiation, but you were strongly encouraged to write a book. You were strongly encouraged to write a methodology, prepare your own unique, quote unquote, unique methodology, and I have to say at the end of that's all bullshit. I mean, to your point, you're fabricating stuff. You're making it up because there isn't really a difference in what there were 42 of us in my cohort. There really wasn't much of a difference in the 42 of us, and to gratuitously go out and copy paste together your differentiator, and it's not you, it's not the authentic you, and it's really devaluing words, because the more words we all put out that don't actually have any real meaning mean nothing. And what it means, and I saw it in the executive coaching profession, that the profession was flooded by people like me, and consequently, I think something that had some meaning was diluted significantly by all of the people coming on and saying stuff, and in a sense promising things that they couldn't deliver on. And after a while, there's just so much noise that people just.
Yeah, a lot of times people buy the promise, even though they know they're not going to be getting that down the road, be it a car or a course or a coach or anything like that.
It's interesting.
Yeah, something else I'd like to get your opinions on. I find that bad business leaders, autocrats and tyrants, bad brands are very lazy. I don't really consider them very smart. And here's why. It's easier to lie. It's so easy to come up with a lie to explain things away or divert attention or to not have to deal with things. I find the much smarter people working in science and engineering, folks that organize and coordinate our cities, those that are putting together new products, especially in the social innovation side, those kinds of services, because they have to, on their own or in small groups, realize that when they start to move toward explaining something away, there's an opportunity, there's information there that you can use to start to shape things to go in a different and a better direction. And it takes really hard work to change the world. But the folks that don't lie and that do the hard work, they're the ones that are able to identify what is that valued differentiator, so that it's not something that you just say, it's something that you do. Because at the end of the day, I think there are two kinds of people: those that categorize and those that don't. No, seriously, I think I think there are people that do things for others and people that first think of doing things to others. And the liars are in the two category. That's where the value destruction happens. But if you can take that moment when you sense, gee, that doesn't sound quite right, or that's just not quite ingenuous, then you can start working on how do you do things for others. I think that's a tipping point for each of us individually to think about, so that we can push on the right things, build the right things, have the right conversations. Otherwise, we just continue accepting this milieu that we're in that's very messy and is filled with, and I hate this phrase, alternative facts. That was a turning point.
Well, and I think, sort of looking at Rolf's comments, it's the argument, or one can always make the observation, well, we've always had this, and personally, it's just, in the discussions I think I've had with actually everybody here, is it's not working. And so all the blather we're blathering at each other, it's just it's not working. And so if in the space that Mike has some control over, which is his own space and his own profession, to me it's a logical question to say, well, what can we do to stop adding to the pollution? Um, and whether or not the original sin lies with advertising or advertisers, I don't think it is. But the notion that advertisers can work to be more, and maybe truthful is the word that's problematic. Maybe it's ethical. I don't know what it is.
Mhm.
But again, I knew as hard as I tried, I think I was probably more ethical than most of the marketers I was in my industry, but I crossed the line. And I did that out of desperation when you're a young guy and you got a family and you have to make your quota, and there's that last customer at the end of the month, and are you sure you guys have the capability of doing this? Yeah, we do. We can deliver on time. We have the equipment, we have the capability, we have the expertise that we say that what's in the brochure. Look at the brochure; it says it right there. I wrote the brochure. It tells you that we have the capability, and then you run back to the office and you create the capability. Now, I'm not saying all that goes away, but most of that actually, to me, was in its own very small way corrupting. I mean, because when you tell that one little fib, and maybe it's not about lying, but it's stretching the words. And
Yeah.
words get stretched so much and so far, and then they don't have any meaning. So
Mike, in the industry you're involved with and have been involved with, what are the current standards or I guess rules and laws in place to prevent outright lying? I mean, isn't there something that that the consumer can appeal to? And
I think there are other guests for the future that could answer that better, but there are some in the United States, some consumer laws in play. Different industries have different regulations, particularly with regard to drugs, things that you can and can't say. There's a lot more monitoring there. United Laboratories lists products with regard to their safety. Then you've got more popular things, Consumer Reports, and you have buyable awards and prizes as well that a lot of the car dealers go after. We're guaranteed the best in service in the first 6 minutes of ownership. Well, we'll sell you that category for a certain amount of money. So there's a range of things that people are subject to. In my own practice and opinion, it's the older marketers that pay more attention to that. The younger ones aren't as educated about it. And consumers, some of these, how do I say this? Some of these older, let's say more established, I don't mean old as in aged out. Some of the protocols that are in place for protecting consumers are not very good at advertising themselves so that consumers understand where they have a leg, where they have the right, what recourse to have, and things like that. Most consumer complaints are heading to social media right now, but there's software there that can either be used to combat that and keep a reputation clean, or they can be used in a more ethical way to help the company clean up its mistakes and improve the design of its products.
Yeah,
so it's really tough. And the challenge is that one challenge is that you have to pay before you get the service. Like we have can we name names? Is that okay?
yeah, of course.
All right. So we have
You
a
can even
Samsung
swear if you want.
Free speech, right? We have a Samsung refrigerator, and it's acted very bizarrely over the 6 years that we've had it. It's quite obvious to us as consumers that it has manufacturing defaults in it, not just one unit, but design flaws, because there are multiple websites with thousands of users on them trying to fight the company to get replacement parts and service and replacements and things like that. There is more than one class action lawsuit. But when you call the company, they toe the line. No, there's nothing wrong with our refrigerator, blah, blah, blah. And they keep selling the same thing. So why is that, Samsung? Why don't you just do the right thing for customers? You're destroying the value of your brand and making it harder in the future. I talked to a couple of marketers about that, colleagues of mine. They say, and we're back to that optimizing the cost thing. They say, it's cheaper for them to just have that fight in the mud with a few consumers or a few tens of thousands of consumers than it is to go back and do the design change and repopulate the supply chain, do a recall, or admit any guilt because of the fallout from that. So it boils down to an economic decision. That's what I've heard. I don't know how much of all of that stuff is true. I just know that my refrigerator is not keeping the food at the right temperature and I'm not getting a response.
So if you go back to your big idea, Mike, if I could, Bob, go back to that big idea, and let's say you get an audience with the head of Samsung and you place your big idea before him or her, what do you suppose their reaction would be? Like, if your admonition is, why don't you just tell the truth? How do you think they would respond?
I don't think I'd get the audience.
Okay, well, let's assume that you did.
Yeah, all right. I think I would get, well, it depends. I've had situations similar to that where I've had to call out a leader. Usually it's a client. And sometimes they honestly answer. Honestly, to me, means over time, I figured out that they were telling the truth, not instant understanding of how I thought they felt. They really didn't know, and they made it right. Because that was not in their value set. That was not the direction that they gave their executive leadership team. And they're embarrassed. So they act instantly. There's no pause. They just fix it because that's the way they're wired. Mm. Others will talk it away, and others will use delay tactics. So you get a whole variety of different responses there.
Yeah. And, it's, I think, and maybe using the word ethics as opposed to, which is, I guess, truth telling is a subset of that. But, and probably I won't name names, but I mean, there's a hotel company that I'm very familiar with that everybody would know. But the reason they're so successful is having had an opportunity to sort of watch from the inside in how they operate. I can say from my personal experience that there was very little word stretching or fabrication or non-truth telling with them. That over many years I came to realize that if they said X was the case, they were almost always right, and just subject to the regular foibles of business. Sometimes it didn't work, and then they would very quickly fess it up. But like you, Mike, I have an experience, and I guess we need to watch this, but it's the kind of experience that I was thinking about. I wound up buying a pretty expensive automobile off of clearly a well-known company, only to find very quickly that you could make toast and refrigerate things sitting in the driver's seat. One's feet were around 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and anything from the waist up, you could see your breath. And it was such an absurd and stupid problem in a brand new car and an expensive one that clearly it was just like some sort of manufacturer's defect and something
design mistake, which is by definition intentional.
But this car and this brand wouldn't do that, right? I mean, because they wouldn't sell you something that was clearly egregious, and so it must be some jam thing in the back that they can fix quickly. And so very quickly you find out, no, everything's working the way it's supposed to. Your car is working perfectly. And I said, okay, well then you burn your feet when you try it, which they wouldn't do. And they all acknowledge, yeah, it's a real it's really hot down there and it's really cold up here. I actually did wind up in a phone call with the senior vice president in the country for that car. And and the point of this is, I had found out through reading on the internet that this car had been declared a lemon in several U.S. states, and states where you had to get your money back.
Mm-hmm.
And so I confronted the senior vice president and I said, why are you selling a product that you clearly know to be defective? And you can tell when you talk to enough vendors and people in the industry, as I did, that there's a lot of wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Like, everybody does know about the problem, but to your point, nobody admits it. And I understand that system. I understand that senior vice president didn't want to go to the world and say, our product's a piece of shit, don't buy it. Everybody that has sales quotas right now to sell this product, we're going to let you off the hook. You don't need to sell the... Of course, they all had to move their inventory. But if you look at that whole process, it's... I don't want to sound like... I guess to some people, I'm always going to sound naive on these things, or we are. But it's just wrong that vehicle got to the point where it was in market, because I don't know how you could get to market.
Sure.
And this was a North American car, and have the kind of problems ultimately with hundreds of thousands of owners. There was just something flawed about that process. And one can say there's a lot of things, but I have to believe that ethics or truth telling was part of that. And also just how people actually, I think to your point, there's a cynical point that what does it really matter? I mean,
well, but maybe you get us to the point where we're talking about the consumer response, and if this type of deception is a fact of doing business, and people, ever since they started advertising 9 out of 10 dentists recommend Dentyne, people have been becoming a little cynical of claims. To what degree, and I'm thinking as an educator, to what degree do we need to educate the public and make sure that part of the education system and even in our after school educational opportunities, we're really doing a good job of not only giving people the tools they need for self-advocacy, but really doing a good job in the area of media literacy in terms of, okay, my 15-year-old can, when he watches a movie, he'll say product placement, because someone has taken that and as a mandate in their teaching. But maybe we just need to be better consumers. If this is a fact that, notwithstanding Mike's big idea.
Isn't the truth that we all need to be increasingly all of these things? Like, it's not pick one. It's, as humans, we got to walk and chew gum.
Right.
I mean, yes, right. It's a literacy
Dentyne,
issue.
by the way, Dentyne.
But
Trident.
But if we're training our kids not to believe this shit, I mean, it seems to me there's an argument not to say the shit. Like,
yeah.
And of course we're always going to sell. I mean, we all need to sell. And so now here's an interesting question, Mike. You've been trying to put into practice this ethos. So it's not like you came up with this idea 3 weeks ago and you've been trying to act ethically for the last 3 weeks to see if it fits. You've been that way your whole life. I mean, this idea has come out of your evolving sensibility as a marketer. So the question I have is, how do you find it resonates with customers? I mean, what does it mean in practice when you try and put it into practice?
It's really interesting. I'll take that question at face value, and then I'll ask you to help me dig in a little bit further. But there are clients who really don't care. And they're the same ones who would do things to their customers. There are those who care, who want to do things for their customers, who believe their businesses exist to create value for others, and that profit is their reward for doing their job well. Profit is not their aim. It is a byproduct of delivering value for another. Back to the two kinds of people, I see that more and more and more now. And there are a lot more folks that are moving into that camp of, I want to do the right thing the right way for the right reasons. And we're starting to see that. A few years ago, a friend of mine introduced me to the idea of a glass box brand. It was a new term at the time. I think it's pretty much had its bell curve. But the idea is that consumers now, or at the time, like to look inside the company before they chose who they were going to spend their money with. And it was as true for houses and cars and big expensive equipment as it was for things like getting a LinkedIn account or a Facebook account or buying a pair of thongs to wear to or
Did you say
flip-flop things that you wear to the beach. So the way a company behaved had a lot to do with how people felt about it. Was it true on the inside? So the glass box idea was that you could see into the company. Even websites like glass, what's it called?
Glass ceiling?
No,
Glassdoor.
Glassdoor. And there's another one called Fucked Company. Apologies to those of you who speak French in Canada. It's all about telling the truth on the inside, because that's becoming more important for customers. But Bob, you may have meant something a little deeper than that.
No, not especially. In fact, I was looking for the practical edge there. That, that's something that resonates. I mean, it's interesting. One of the people that was active in our world is a fellow who, I don't think he would mind me saying that. I'm not going to name him, but he'll guess if he listens to this who I'm talking about. But he and I started out in the same industry, which was the printing industry 35 years ago or whatever it is now, 40. And he was somebody that is one of those people that he was, let's put it this way, he was a very good sales guy. He could sell refrigerators to the proverbial, whoever. And it was, and I always had problems with how he played loose with the truth, I suppose. And I lost track with him. Now he was a great guy, but that's one thing I always wondered about. But I ran into him after 30 years. We kind of reconnected, and his transformation was pretty astounding to the position you're talking about being much more thoughtful. I mean, I think he had reflected on, some of the stuff that I guess, to be fair, we had done in our early days in terms of how and what we sold. And I think he had concluded, well, I know he had concluded by the end of his career that working, you put it really well. The distinction between those that sell something and those that provide a service. I'm not saying it as well.
Doing something for others to create value for others, rather than doing to or taking value first.
Yeah. And if I think of younger people too, I mean, that just seems to be more the that's, I guess, the sustainable way of selling. So we've talked a lot, sort of as we have, to the best of our ability, in a sense, around the philosophy of this. I guess the execution is that you had suggested, which again I found particularly resonant, that we focus on the executives in agencies. And again, Rolf's raising some great questions or points, and one of the things but there's sort of broad philosophical discussions which are critical, so not to diminish them at all. But there's also too the requirement to say what's a sliver of something we can do about something. And so Mike having identified that in my profession, speaking for Mike, in my profession, in the profession of marketing, I think we need to clean up how we market, how we sell. and we need to do it in a more ethical manner, whatever that means. The question then remains, how are you going to do that? And you can dismiss the idea as, even unneeded, not necessary, but we're certainly not going to do any harm by trying to get our fellow marketers to, adopt something that some sort of adopt, but also adhere to some sort of ethical code. So the question is, the point is, you had identified the associations, like the American Advertising Association, Direct Marketing Association, and what I found resonant from the perspective of Boom was that's a pretty defined, tight group. You want to talk about that?
Sure. There are dozens of these groups that control the huge majority of paid advertising dollars. So it's a very tight focus. To be even more specific, the ask or the approach is to get these several dozen organizations to put truth into their ethics and to add one governing principle, which is to promote those ethics to their members. The idea is to get each of their member companies to put those ethics in. So we're talking consultant to consultant. We're not talking about moving money, doing budgets, changing behaviors. We're just trying to get, it's kind of like passing a bill, but on the moral side of the compass. And I thought that's something that could happen within the 10 years. There's one more thing I wanted to share. I think that with the technology that we have today, it's possible for us to create a proof about truth using blockchain. Because what people say, the decisions they make matter. How much things get amplified is what we're measuring on social media right now. How many hits did you get? How much eyegloss or eyeliner did you sell as a result of being a TikTok influencer? But what about the good your truth has done? We have the ability to use blockchain and other technologies to track things that are non-cash, that are value orienting, value creating. That is, in my opinion, a simple approach, because these technologies are put at the root of CRM systems, checkout systems, things like that, where they can be turned on as always on telemetry to help us understand the effects of ideas flowing through, of truths flowing through. So the idea of tracking more than cash is important. It also would let the business owners who are not telling truths or who are making these unethical decisions have the kind of information that they could use to fix some of the things going on in their business. These folks, whether they're good or bad, ethical or not, truth tellers or lying providers, are very good optimizers. Folks in business are good at optimizing. Most of the folks in business are good at optimizing one thing. Let me get more profit, okay? Most of the folks that are complaining about it, citizens like us, are dealing with having to optimize a lot of things at the same time. So I believe humans are wired to be able to manage these more complex strategies because they have to do it just to live their lives. What if we had the right information? What if the dashboard was available to these leaders? They might be able to make better decisions. So the place to start is with a blockchain, with some ethics, and start to track through and see what kind of information we can create, and then help people use that to make decisions that are not just good for them, but that are good for us. And you've heard that phrase, they'll get around to it, or, we all wait for them to do it in Washington or in our local county to fix the road or something like that. But there's a hell of a lot more we than there are they. And if we start speaking up a little bit more, if we start promoting the truth, if we start talking about the things that we want, if we move individually to behave more ethically, it will have an impact. I believe it can overwhelm in a good way.
Will there be NFTs involved?
I have no clue. I still haven't figured that out.
Well, neither have I. I was
want to
hoping
be
you
on
might
that
have
one.
Yeah, I've heard the sort of similar idea just around political, fact checking and I'm not sure that I'm not sure that it's not a no-brainer exercise to create the kind of platform you're talking about. And one thing I would always urge in these discussions is, my ability as a marketer, your ability as a marketer, your experience as a marketer to me gives you the permission to talk about what you're talking about.
As
When
does
we,
yours.
sorry, all those, yeah, and that's a big enough and a daunting enough challenge. If you want to actually have any hope of changing the behavior of people, of our peers in business, it's going to be that's challenging enough.
And start with yourself. And all these things that we've talked about, I just want to remind everybody that's listening, these are not, hopeful, wishful strategies. They're things that we can all do, but there's no wait until X, Y, or Z happens, or wait for a technology to start behaving differently. Realize that, we live in a world that's a little bit more at risk than it was before, and
Well,
do the right thing.
well, my point in that was that to say let's go after the advertising associations is big, and if that was your epitaph at the end of your career, that you had managed to get the advertising industry to change its way of being, that would be a big one. So I would be inclined to sort of the real time sort of fact checking thing. That's another one, because that's another one. If you had that as your epitaph, that would be, so it's like, so in terms of our approach here, I think it's what I found resonant was a fairly well, in fact, I thought a clear sort of notion of the problem that you could solve, and in a sense you had permission to address because of your experience, and also the specificity of who this is targeted at.
Mhm.
5, 10, 15, 20,000 people. If we could get 5 or 10 or 15,000 people to modify their behavior, to adjust their behavior. The question then is, as you mentioned, that of your peers, there's more and more, maybe a majority of your peers now are more inclined to feel the way you do. The question always with the boom discussion is then how do we get that? How do we mobilize that discussion and get that group of people to do something? And that's how we're kind of ending this session now. But
So it's up to Catarina von Maydell to figure that out, because she's our next guest.
yes, that's right. Yes, everybody has seen her name there, and we did promise to kick Mike out at 1:00. So just kidding. You can stay as long as you want.
Thank you.
I think really we should almost do this at the end of the day with drinks. That actually might make more sense.
Well, if you're going to get into Wittgenstein, a glass of wine would be a very, very good idea.
Yeah. So is there any? So I think you said your last bit, Mike. But is there anything that is left into your?
I something that rewards. Yes, one more thought. First of all, thanks to David and to Rolf for all the comments. Thanks to you guys for putting this on. It's a pleasure. I really, really enjoy the conversation. When we grew up, going back to the very beginning, I was first disappointed about lying when I was a kid by having products lie to me through advertising. We talked about that in the podcast. Yeah. Something else that happened to me as a child is that we got rewarded for doing the right things. Something the association of advertising groups, or whatever these different groups are too, they could add to their equivalent of the Academy Awards, is rewards for telling the truth. That would be another.
Actually, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool.
It elevates it. Yeah.
The one, and sort of my last parting thought on this is, there's a set of tenets that I will always refer to that, in fact, all of us were involved in putting together in a long and exhaustive a long, long exhaustive issue. In fact, David Guthrow was one of the very first who was involved in that with me, who's I think still here. Was so to me, it's a simple. I'd like to see I'd like to see this play in some way, and that is to find the advertising agency executive who would look at those tenants and say, "Yeah, I believe that," and then say to him or her, then how do you incorporate that into the DNA of everything you do, not just personally but in your business life? And it would be a real challenge to all of us. I mean, the tenants don't say don't lie, interestingly enough. Kind of maybe that's an obvious one, but when you read the tenants, it's pretty hard to lie after you've read the tenants and say, well, lying would be, it's not consistent.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, agreed.
we need to hold ourselves accountable to something, I guess is what I'm saying. And so, and part of the leaders of us who consider ourselves to be agile, we need to hold ourselves accountable too. And so, Catarina, are you here? You should be.
I am, yes. Hello.
Good. Well, that you were really courteous, and you covered your camera and made sure you weren't stealing any of Mike's thunder. That's really appreciated, especially by Mike.
Good to meet you, Catarina. I'll sign off now. Thank you, everyone.
Okay,
Really
thanks a lot, Mike.
Before you go, it was really interesting to hear your ideas. So thank you for sharing those.
Thank you. And I'll be hearing yours as soon as I replay. So
Or you can stay on. Okay, anyway. Take care, Mike. We'll see you again soon. And so, Catarina, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you doing today? You guys have had a really interesting conversation.
We have, and it's been augmented by a significant audience participation, which is great. So, I did remind everybody. I don't think I said this at the beginning, that this is being recorded and will be posted on Boom Big Ideas as well. So I'm delighted to have you as our second guest. Stephen doesn't really count because he's a co-host. But
thanks.
no,
Have
next
you been elevated or demoted? Probably. Let's say elevated. You've been elevated.
in the next episode, Stephen is going to be both the guest interviewee and the co-host. So that'll be an interesting experience. But here in this episode, we're privileged to have Catarina here, a former member of the Leaders Expedition when we were putting all that together. And you have, well, first of all, do you want to introduce yourself? Just to give your background? And
That's a really good question, and I should have that one down pat. I don't.
None of us do. Yeah.
So one of the conversations I seem to be having in terms of explaining how I got here, and I'm going to try and keep it short, is I come from a family with lots of history, and it's not necessarily a historied family, but a family who experienced lots of history, tumult. And because of those family experiences, because of my personal life experiences, that's sort of all the things that led me up to where I am. And some of the personal life experiences include having lived in 6 countries, 3 continents, at various ages, mostly as a professional, but also as a kid. I started in the financial industry and the international capital markets, and then worked domestically with high net worth investors, and eventually transitioned into working with angel investors, venture capitalists, and helping high-tech entrepreneurs to build their businesses, startups. And then in a very convoluted way, I ended up working in the academic environment as a professor or lecturer. So I was working in China for UK universities, and now I'm here back in Toronto and teaching at the college level. So that's sort of a really quick summary. And the reason I sort of give that rambling discussion is because all of those life experiences, everything from sort of that family history to lived experience to working in multiple industries in several countries, it's a really unique way of looking at the world. And it really got me to where I am now in terms of this idea of what does agility really mean? And more importantly, what kind of leadership do we actually need? And I think I was sort of, through a variety of mechanisms, I was given sort of this gift of thinking quite differently than other people. And it's only really been in the last 10 years that I'm understanding that it's actually a powerful way of thinking. It's not necessarily the only way or the best way, but it definitely is much more powerful. But it also can be very threatening to a lot of people who are not used to it, because it's really, I mean, really, I've survived by asking a lot of questions and just generally being extremely curious. But that's not always that welcome.
No.
Can I ask just a quick question, Catarina? How would you describe that way of thinking? What are some of the questions that drive you, and that curiosity, general questions about the world?
Very, very good question. So the things let me answer it from a slightly different perspective, and then I'll get back to answering the actual question that you asked. We're in a position where, everybody talks about VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. And I think a lot of people sort of understand it in two dimensions. And I think most people, including leaders I've worked with, they understand stuff in two dimensions, but they're not really understanding it three-dimensionally. And the third dimension to me is sort of that experiential. Whether it's actually the third dimension or not, doesn't matter, but there's a granularity and a texture that a lot of people are missing, because they've been educated from textbooks, they've been educated in classes where they have to earn marks. And really, mastery is knowledge, which is what we learn in school, skills, which is what we start learning when we start working, but it's the rare person that actually truly develops mastery. And mastery we can talk about as intuition, of how do you actually start leveraging your intuition. And to me, intuition is not an airy-fairy thing. There's very, very clear research around this. How do we really start leveraging our intuition, which requires expert knowledge, and it requires a range of expertise. So that's really the part that I'm interested in. And the way that I got to it is my family, my parents grew up, they were Baltic Germans, which is quite different than Germans. It's not quite, but it's a different culture, it's a different life experience. So throughout my dad's childhood and predating my dad's childhood, and my mom had it to some extent too, it was a very politically, geographically important place. So therefore they were constantly in war, and they always had to pay attention to very, very complex situations. So my dad and my mom grew up with this concept, and many cultures have this. But as North Americans, for people born and raised in North America, we don't have to deal with that complexity. Things have been pretty straightforward for most of our lives, right? So it's that type of stuff. It's for me, having lived in multiple different cultures, and really seeing how do people think differently, and what drives their behavior, because it's actually quite different from culture to culture. As humans, we're all the same. But in terms of cultures, that's what influences us very differently. So the part that I'm really interested in is, how can we help people behave differently? And it's not just think differently, because thinking is only part of that problem. We also have to work with and I say feelings, but it's really our physiology, and emotions are the tip of the iceberg of physiology. So, we have to think differently, we have to feel differently, and we have to act differently, and act is what we do with other people. And that's really, how do we engage with more people? How do we collaborate, and truly collaborate? Not this, people at best, they cooperate, but they're not really collaborating. So that's what I'm really interested in. Does that actually answer the question?
No, it does. It does. Thank you.
So, the sort of the theory, or the point of view that you wanted to elevate, how would you frame that?
So because we're going into this increasingly VUCA world, and a lot of people are saying we're going into VUCA, and the reality is we've always had some element of VUCA. But again, as North Americans, we've been pretty insulated from a lot of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. And our businesses in particular have been able to operate very much according to scripts and recipes, or best practices, or whatever we want to call it. Mm-hmm. You guys have been talking about the advertising industry and how different companies can get away with making unethical decisions. It's not exactly what you guys said, but that was sort of the gist of it.
Yeah.
And I think that is a function of a number of different things. It's a function of the system that's evolved that allowed people to do that. There's complicity from a range of different environments. And really what we need to do is change systems, but in order to change systems, we have to change ourselves first. Systems do not change top down. So there's a lot of people who are working on system transformation. And quite bluntly, my personal belief, which is contentious, is that if we're not first focusing on how do we change people, their thinking, feeling, and acting, if we're not changing that, then it really doesn't matter what else we do. However, people cannot change if the systems don't change. So there has to be a concurrent approach to this. And so for me, really, it's how do we develop leadership that is much more agile, so that we can really iteratively keep improving at the human level, at the individual level, at the collective level, and at the system and organizational levels.
Fascinating.
I think so.
So talk then about some of the of what are the attributes, the true attributes of agile leader, that you would develop.
So I'm in the process of developing a model. I had been doing my PhD, and I'm not finishing the PhD, but I'm trying to convert that research into a book. What I have been focused on is what is real behavior change. And the reason I got to that point, the reason I started the PhD and was interested in the research in particular, is because when I look at all the existing behavior change models, they're not really incorporating as much as I think they should have. It's very, very cognitively based, as well as other things. And there's a whole bunch of things that are missing. So my research included neuroscience, among other stuff, so adult education, and it was rooted in the entrepreneurial space. And the reason I think it's really important to root it in the entrepreneurial space is because, to me, agility and entrepreneurship and lots of other words that we can use like that are basically the same thing. So from a process perspective, what we need to do is we need to go through a cycle of innovating, commercializing, and engaging. And because it's sort of a continuous process, it doesn't really matter where we start. But it's this idea of we need to collaboratively, which means that we need to actually really challenge the status quo together. So there's this idea of creative conflict, which is not conflict in any possible way, as we're seeing in other parts of the world right now, but it's creative conflict. How do we do it very constructively? And so that's the engaging part. And the innovation is where do we actually then focus on trying to understand things? So there's two parts to innovation: exploration and experimentation. And exploration is really how do we understand things right now? And the reality is what we understand today is going to be different in a week, different in a month, different in a year, because we're constantly learning and we're constantly personally growing in ways that allow us to actually start perceiving things differently. Because it's not all up here, it's also what our whole body is doing in our ability to absorb information and process it and comprehend it. Once we explore, then we can come up with a hypothesis. And some people do it formally, most people do it informally. Let's run an experiment. What are we testing? And so you run an experiment and you measure it and see what happens. And measurement needs to be quantitative, which is what most people do, but there also needs to be qualitative, this sort of like touchy-feely kind of measurement stuff. And then once we figure out some things that work, then we have to go into the commercialization process. How do we make money from it? How do we capture value? If it's a social enterprise as opposed to a for-profit enterprise, how do we actually capture value? How do we change things? And then we have to go back to the engagement and the innovation, the exploration, and say, okay, who else do we need to have in this conversation? How should we engage people? What's the right way of doing that? And then how do we start mapping what we understand now based on what we've learned in the past, right? So it's this continuous innovation. So that's the process. And then within that process is the personal piece, the thinking, feeling, acting, where at each stage we have to develop different ways of thinking, different ways of processing information. We have to always sort of touch base and say, ooh, I didn't like that. I don't like that person. I can't listen to them, right? So we always have emotional reactions, good and bad. Or we think, oh my God, that person is so brilliant. And then we believe everything they say and we're not critical. So our emotions and our physiology, which are based on our nervous system responses, which are survival responses. We have to learn how to become more in tune with our physiology so that we can learn to listen better, learn to absorb information better, learn to process information better, start changing our mindsets and our beliefs and our sense of identity, because how I identify myself in each situation will determine how I interact with the people I'm interacting with, right? Yeah, so hopefully that sort of captures it.
Yeah. You had a question, Stephen?
Well, I'm just thinking, when you talk about identity and how we see ourselves in our worlds, whatever the context we're in, those identities start to be built very early in life. And how do you and I know in education we're talking about mindset, and we're talking about changing mindsets of 7-year-olds. I mean, so when you get to work with people at the leadership level, that's a lot of unpacking to do. What are some of the strategies that you found to be successful in beginning that conversation?
So then there's another 3 things I keep talking about: readiness, willingness, and ability. So nobody's mindsets, nobody's sense of identity or beliefs are going to change until they're ready to. And unfortunately, it almost is some sort of pain point, right? There has to be some sort of frustration or fear or anger that triggers people to want to change. I think it's less about telling people what to do. It's a matter of when people start recognizing something's not working, they're ready to start talking about what needs to happen. That's, I think, where we can start supporting people. And then we have to help them with their willingness. Like, how do we start getting them comfortable with their physiology that's holding them back and blocking things or opens things up? And how do we also teach them the competencies? Again, competencies are knowledge, skill, and mastery. How do we teach them the competencies and develop those competencies so that they can actually start being much more introspective and reflective? So in terms of helping leaders, in my experience, actually, let me answer it from a slightly different perspective. The reason it's so important is because how we perceive ourselves will completely influence how we work with others. Mm-hmm. There's a really brilliant research paper, and there's many, there's extensive research done on this, but there was one research paper where they took male hiring managers, gave them 2 identical resumes, one with a male name, one with a female name, and they also did a psychographic profile on these managers. The managers who identified as male first and manager second discriminated more against the female candidates. The managers who identified as managers first and men second, in that circumstance, because the reality is when they're with their spouses, they're going to identify as men first, more likely, right? So each situation will determine what our identity is and what priority we put on it. So those managers that identified as managers first and men second, they discriminated less against the female candidates. So when people can start recognizing that, when you start, and it's not so much about facts, it's really about experiences where people start hearing somebody say, here's my personal experience. So one thing that I think is really interesting is, as we talk about Black Lives Matter and Me Too and whatever social justice issues we're talking about, it really doesn't matter. There's a lot of, I think the majority of men are very, very well-intentioned. And just for the record, I think there's a lot of women who are not very well-intentioned. So this is not a male problem. This is a societal problem. So I think most men are very well-intentioned, but for a variety of reasons, they've just never had to see how much women or people of color have to put up with. And what's interesting is, as more and more stories are told, more and more men are starting to, and more white people are starting to recognize, wow, there's a whole bunch of stuff I didn't see, and what's my part in it? So that's the readiness part. And when people start asking those questions, then it's a question of how do we help guide ourselves? Because the reality is all of us can learn. It's not about one person changing, because we have to change the whole society too, right? How do we start collectively and individually starting to have conversations with ourselves and with other people in ways that we can challenge each other? We're back to this creative conflict and challenging the status quo. How do we start building norms around being able to challenge each other without actually threatening each other and without feeling threatened? Once we can do that, then we can start recognizing, I was showing up with this identity first, and I completely ignored this other identity, right? So it really is about how do we start creating the conditions for individuals and for groups to really start engaging in much more curiosity-based conversations.
It sounds like a great therapy session.
So, yeah.
How would you see acting on this? So, I mean, you have lots of experience at business schools. And I agree, the kind of change you're talking about. I mean, I see this very much as a sense-making kind of discussion, and I'm familiar with sense-making and made a modest contribution to some writing on it. But the question, it's a competency that, at the end of the day, we all need to learn. In fact, I would agree it's a core competency that should be part of every human's social DNA. I mean, how they interact with the world should utilize that competency. But that's some time off. So the question is, how do we get from here to there?
Having conversations and being open to conversations. It's really a matter of just start doing it. I mean, it sounds like a really simple and glib answer, but the only way systems change is when we change. The only way we change is through experimentation. And same thing with systems too, but we're the ones that have to do the experimentation. So it's a matter of all change starts with individuals. And so what we need to do is start challenging ourselves in places that we're willing to take those risks and in places where the risks aren't too big. And really saying, so I have a friend or with my partner or, with somebody I actually have a relationship with, how do I start having difficult conversations? But it doesn't necessarily need to be difficult conversations where you're challenging them, but
No.
It could be conversations that generally you avoid because they're impolite, and I'm not suggesting doing impolite things. What I'm suggesting is it really impolite to not have conversations about certain topics? Or is it more because it's safe and we're fear-based, or it's safe and we just don't want to have to deal with the fallout of it? Or, there's many legitimate reasons, but really there's a lot of conversations we're avoiding more because it's just convenient to avoid them. But the reality is we need to start having a range of conversations. And more importantly, we have to start developing the competencies and the comfort with having those conversations. So, where to start? Just start by the next time you're talking to somebody and you notice that you're kind of tightening up and saying, ooh, I want to stop that conversation. It's uncomfortable. Then question yourself and say, what's the risk of having this conversation and what's the benefit? And if the benefit is simply that I can learn, and I can even enlist that other person and say, hey, I notice we always get to the edge of this conversation, but we always stop here. Are you willing to give it a shot and see if we can actually go further and really start challenging how we think about things and really start thinking about how we talk about things and how we feel about things? And are you willing to do that with me? And let's just see where it ends up. And we won't necessarily come to an answer because there is never a single answer. But maybe we'll come away with different insights. And more importantly, maybe we'll start realizing some of these conversations we should be having but are not. Maybe it actually is kind of fun and kind of interesting. And for me, fun is different than it is for other people. For me, fun is curiosity and learning. It's not always, the jokes and stuff, but it's, how can we keep pushing our envelopes in very constructive ways?
It's interesting in elementary schools in Canada and elsewhere, when we all got up to do our annual public speaking, we were told that we were not allowed to talk about religion, politics, or sex. And I think those are the things that we really need to be talking about the most. Those are the domains where the difficult conversations, are to be had, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's good reason, and there's times and place. I mean, everything has a time and a place, right? I'm not suggesting that we start going onto the TTC on the public transit and start talking hardcore politics with somebody. But so we have to pick the right time and the right place, but there's so many things that we need to start addressing and being honest about, because they guide our beliefs and our identities, they guide our societies, they influence how we act. And if we're not, but we have to chip away at it. It's not like we can change the whole system all at once. We need to sort of chip away at it gradually. And the important part is the learning piece, right? Because I'm not an academic by any stretch, but there are some academic words I just love. And in the entrepreneurial space, there's this idea of causation and effectuation. Causation is the old school, which is exactly what we need to get away from, which is there are answers and we just need to find them. We don't have enough resources, we just need to get them. But there's nothing about creativity and creation and creativity and all that, that whole innovation piece. Effectuation, on the other hand, is, and I'm sort of bastardizing the definition, but it's along the lines of making things happen or co-creating things with the resources you've got available, right? So it's MacGyver, basically. It's like, you got a paper clip and a penknife and you need to build a nuclear bomb or something, hopefully we won't have any more nuclear bombs given the circumstances, but, we have to learn how to really do things with what we've got. Like, I don't know how many people keep saying, well, we don't have the budget. And it's like, well, you don't even have an idea. So you can get a budget if you have a good idea and you can make a good case for it. So we're sort of starting from the wrong place. And this idea of effectuation assumes the answers do not exist. We need to create them. And even if an answer exists, it's probably not the right answer, given that contexts are different for everything. So we constantly need to co-create things, and it has to be together with other people, ideally with people who think very differently than us, the diversity argument, so that we can actually really learn and figure out how do we approach problems more effectively.
Go ahead,
Bob. Okay, I was just going to throw out my two favorite academic words, and they are epistemology and ontology. And I know in our working with Indigenous communities, we realize that that those two things are really combined in an Indigenous way of knowing. But Western philosophy and psychology and cognition, we've separated those two things. But I wanted to go back to the identity piece a little bit, because the way I see myself in the world, the way I know things in the world, or the way I think I know things in the world, is intimately linked with my ontology, like who I am or who I believe I am.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, it would be great for me to be able to have a difficult conversation with my own family around this time. I can't. I'm the only liberal-minded person in my family. I realize now. We just avoid those questions. We avoid those conversations, and it's my most unfavorite place to be right now is with my family because of that. So I've thrown out a lot of ideas right there, a lot of threads, but it's so tied up with who we believe we are and who we think we are, and the confidence that goes with it. It's.
So I think there's something that's really important to acknowledge in the situation. When we have a hard time talking to other people, or when we start getting into conflict with other people, we always think it's a cognitive thing. We always think it's because they see the world differently, and it's based on beliefs and everything else, of course. A lot of times when we actually get into real conflict is because we feel unsafe, and so a lot of people, where I seem to differ from many other people, but I'm one microcosm in a very large community of people who believe that the nervous system is really what we should be focusing on, not the brain. The brain is part of the nervous system, but it does not drive our behavior. And there's quite a bit of research to prove this out. And we could go into a long tangent, but so I'm more focused on our nervous system, of which the brain is a part of. So whenever we get into any type of conflict, whether it's people that we're very intimate with, family, spouses, partners, close friends, or people further away, what's happening is different aspects of ourselves are feeling threatened. And it's not necessarily that we're physically threatened or feeling physically threatened, but our existence, our sense of identity, who we are, is feeling threatened. Our belonging to a tribe, our belonging to a community. All of those things are threatened. And when that happens, that's when we start getting really angry and really dangerous. So
as we're saying.
So when we're in that situation, what we first have to focus on is how do we make each other feel safe? And then we can start having the conversations, but we cannot have the conversations if we cannot make the other people and ourselves feel safe. I mean, it doesn't mean that every family or every group that has its rifts is not going to be solved right away, because then you still need to deal with the cognitive issues and the belief system and the identity systems. But you can't even start those conversations if everybody is not feeling safe. And it's this idea of psychological safety. And I think the way Amy Edmondson was writing about psychological safety, I think she gets it right, but I think the way people talk about it is oversimplified. People are looking at psychological safety as a mechanical thing. Do we have the right rules in place? Do we have this and that in place? And they're not really focusing on everything needs to be focused on how do we make sure that everybody's nervous system is feeling safe and not going to fight, flight, or freeze.
Right. Fascinating. Bob, I've hijacked your show here.
No, one of the, I mean, sort of the notion of diversity is to me something I struggle with. As a 60 something white guy, I have, to the best of my ability, certainly developed an entirely different sense of diversity than even 10 years ago. But and 5 or 6 years ago, when I got active in trying to the whole make the world a better place thing, I kind of had a sense that a very broad tent is what was required, and you wanted to try and include all the voices within that very large tent. And so when we talk about collaboration and we talk about diversity, I guess where I have personally netted out is it's a narrower tent than I originally thought, because there's a section on the fringes that it's just not worth, like one has to have the same language and something of the same starting point. Now it depends, I guess, on the context. If a ship sinks and there are 10 survivors on an island, each speaking a different language, I mean, you're going to figure that out pretty quickly if you're going to survive. But it's that is not necessarily, those aren't necessarily learnings that apply to the kind of situations we're talking about. So it's, when you say you need to have as many, the greatest diversity possible, I guess I'm making an obvious statement, but there has to be some boundaries around that.
Well, I don't think every situation needs the greatest diversity possible. I think each situation requires that we think about what type of diversity do we need. And diversity, to me, there's, again, in academic research, they make the definition that diversity, they don't do it along lines of people's ethnicity or background. What diversity really needs to be is different ways of thinking, different life experiences, different perspectives, etc. So what's required is to make sure that the right types of stakeholders and the right types of diversity are there. And one thing that's really interesting that's being talked about a lot in the diversity and inclusion space, which is something that I've sort of observed elsewhere, is that just because you have different looking people doesn't actually mean you have diversity of thought. Because a lot of people who are outsiders by one measure or another learn how to play by the rules and therefore are just the same voices, but in a different body, right? So we have to be really careful that diversity really needs to be based on thinking differently, different life experiences, different perspectives, and so on. And that's not an easy answer. And I don't think there's ever a right answer. Do you have enough diversity? Do you have the right type of diversity? Blah, blah, blah. But I mean, it's something that we constantly need to reflect on. Are we hearing from the people that we're not hearing? Are we actually able to listen to them? Are there maybe different people who can tell the story in a different way? So there's lots of things like that. Going to your comment about the fringe people, what we have to recognize is the fringe people are usually the ones that have the most imbalanced nervous system. So they're the ones that are the most extreme in the fight, flight, or freeze stage. Well, they're not freeze because they're on the fringe. So they're the most probably in the fight stage of fear response, threat response. Do we have to get them into the room? Do we have to get everybody into the room? No, not all at once. There's definitely, so this is more of a process question of how and when do you start bringing people together? And I was involved very, very peripherally with the Toronto drug strategy creation, and it was done masterfully by an organization called ICA. And what they did is they got a whole bunch of people in different parts of the community where there was a lot of contention. And they very gradually over time first talked with people who are like-minded and the different pockets. Then they started getting different groups in very small numbers to start talking to each other. So they very gradually laddered up how much diversity was in the room at any one point in time. So they were doing two things. They were building a process. They did three things. They were building a process that people became familiar with and knew the rules of the game. They were building understanding where people were starting to listen to each other. And the part that I think was most important is they were also developing those competencies. So people, because they trusted the system, they were able to start engaging more effectively. Right. So ultimately, we do need to listen to those fringe people. And whether or not we agree with them, you know, there's some things that I heard over the last few weeks where I just thought, boy, that person is not the smartest person. But we can't delegitimize their sense of fear. And so what we need to do, and when I say we, it's the right person at the right time in the right way, needs to work with those fringe people and say, you know, maybe you're misunderstanding, but before we can even start having intellectual conversations with them and helping them with their reasoning and understanding what is it that we're not understanding about what their life experience is, we first have to talk about the nervous system and help getting them into a state where we can even engage with them.
It's interesting you mention ICA because that was where my first facilitation training came way back in the
They're
early
fantastic.
90s. Yeah. And it was that organization that changed my mind around the idea of consensus. And I remember John, I think his name was saying consensus isn't getting everyone to agree. The question is, has everyone been heard? And so, but over time, my view of even that statement has changed, because it's to say that everyone's been heard doesn't mean that they've actually voiced what they wanted to voice, but have we heard it in you know, the way it needs to be. Absorbed it. Yeah. Powerful stuff.
Yeah. And again, it really comes back to, and that's our personal responsibility, is how do we learn to put ourselves in that state where we can actually listen to somebody that we profoundly disagree with.
Yes.
And start listening for where are the commonalities? What are the things that they're saying that I'm not understanding or I'm getting really pissed off at and I just don't want to hear it, as well as other things. So by learning to sort of parse apart what's my part in this conversation and what's their part in this conversation, where do we, you know, that's sort of where we can then start getting into the questions and saying, is this what you mean? Am I understanding this correctly? Can you elaborate and tell me what your life experience, like what was the experience that got you to this? Because I don't get at all what you're talking about, right?
So a question I have, I guess there's maybe two questions here. One is, or an observation, is that all of these discussions, you know, of the nature that, you know, we've just had for the last 40 minutes, they are being conducted and framed and listened to in unfortunately in a bubble, and the people that are not in that bubble are not listening or remotely conversant in what you're talking about. And so, you know, my experience is if with those people, if you try and like they wouldn't even have the language, to, you know, the language you employ or we employ. You know, they would dismiss. So they're not here to have that conversation with. I mean, so the kind of leads to the second observation, and that is when we talk about diversity, and maybe this comes back to my other point, I'm increasingly looking at the hopefully it's 60% or 50%. But one of the things around consensus, or when you used the word a few moments ago about somebody that you vehemently disagree with, I kind of have the view that 20 or 30 years ago, if I vehemently disagreed with somebody, it was on a big issue and it tended to be kind of over there. There weren't a lot of those. Where people now vehemently disagree with people that, in my observation, they actually agree with. I mean, the things that we vehemently disagree on now, we seem to all have triggers where you can get, and I'll use the political terms. I mean, you could get 10 liberals or 10 Republicans in a room, and they won't agree with each other on hardly anything. I mean, and so to me, the first challenge is how do you, amongst the people that claim to agree with each other, because what you're saying is you can have a lot of people that would appear to agree with each other, and then when you sit down and talk about, okay, how are we going to proceed, then everybody has that is proving to me to be a great enough challenge, rather than trying to get the outliers of the discussion. I know that's not necessarily what you're saying, but I mean, does any of that resonate or make sense?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And what you're actually getting at is a much deeper root issue. So the reason I smirked when you said that we have bigger problems now or more fundamental disagreements or something like that than we did 20, 30 years ago. I think 20 or 30 years ago, we had the luxury of ignoring when we had really big differences. And I think because generally most people were economically well off and relatively stable, and the economy was growing and politics was increasingly stable, and especially for North Americans, and especially for white North Americans, life was pretty good. But because I've had enough exposure for a variety of reasons to people who didn't have the same experiences, I can tell you that there were big problems before. They didn't have the luxury of ignoring it. We did.
Yeah. That's a great point.
So I don't necessarily think we actually have bigger problems. It's just we're much more aware of them. And for some of us that have been in this bubble of not having to deal with environmental issues, because it was flooding elsewhere. Well, Europe flooded this year and Western Canada flooded this year. So all of a sudden things are starting to come much closer to home. That's one example of many. Right? Mm-hmm. So we're losing our luxury of ignorance, number one. Number two, I think there's much deeper issues going on where I actually think this contentiousness, where everybody is really digging their heels in on things. I mean, basically our society is, I don't know enough about childhood development, but it's kind of like everybody's reverting to the 2 or 3 year, that's not even 2 years old, because at least they're asking why. Whatever stage children are at when they're basically, it's mine, it's me, it's, and that's a normal part of healthy development. The problem is we as adults are going back to that. And the reason in childhood, that's a normal process because you grow. The reason we're reverting back to it is because of fear and lack of connection. If you think about our nervous system, is the first response we have in a fear situation is, and this is what the polyvagal theory is all about, we don't go into fight or flight first. Our first response is, where's my buddies? Where's my friends?
Yes.
Right? And when there's a bunch of things that have happened is, we have me going and living in all sorts of different countries and over a dozen cities in the world over my lifetime. I don't have the roots, and I'm not, I'm a little bit more unusual because it's more obvious. But when I even look at people I know who've been in Toronto for longer periods of time or other cities as well, they don't have that depth of connection like we did 20, 30 years ago.
In the cities anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I think in general. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think part of it is this mobile life that we have, which has given us freedoms and choices, especially for those of us that don't come from great families or healthy families. So it's a benefit in some ways, and it's given us the opportunity to learn more about the world than maybe people did 2 generations ago.
Mm-hmm.
But what the problem is we also are losing that strength of connection and that real sense of belonging. And then with social media, it's even worse because we have this false sense of belonging, but our nervous system is not registering that we're actually connected with people because we can't rely on our social media friends. And then there's a third part, which is, and there's some early research around this, that when we're constantly on our phones, we're not making eye contact with other people. And one of the best ways for us to regulate our nervous systems is to make eye contact and figure out, are you a friend? Are you an enemy?
Yeah,
Are you
yeah.
on side? Are you looking to help me? And so kids who've been brought up with phones haven't even developed that co-regulation and self-regulation ability. They can, it's not that they don't have it. They just never developed it like a muscle. And for those of us that maybe learned it in childhood because we grew up, where we had to look adults in the eye and we had to, behave in certain ways and stuff. But if we're on internet or, screens all the time, we also are losing that ability to co-regulate. And I think, those are all pieces of a larger puzzle where we simply don't have the connections. And I'm not talking about the formal connections, it's that sense of I belong somewhere. I have a tribe that has my back, and my responsibility is to have the back of everybody else in my tribe as well. And I don't mean it in a tribal sense. I mean it in a real sense of this is my community of safety. This is my community of unconditional love. I don't think we have any of that, or not the way that we need. So I actually think this fragmentation is more a function of an unhealthy nervous system rather than it actually is that issues are bigger. And then as we start having to face these big issues, it's terrifying. And therefore we start behaving like 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds or whatever that age of development is.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned polyvagal theory, and Stephen Porges talks about that. And it talks about a trauma, and I'm thinking of the work of Stuart Shanker as well. In self-regulation, and that the ability to see a different child by seeing the child differently. But if you apply that to what's happening on social media, we make really quick assumptions about the person whose post we have this visceral reaction to, and so we're not able to see them as anything, sometimes as anything other than that idea that we abhor floating by us, and I think that we talk about communities and we talk about collaboration on social media, but there's something missing there, and I think you've pointed out something really important.
Well, one of the issues there is that, and I've watched Twitter exchanges between two people that I know, and I'm convinced they actually agree with each other, but they've utterly misread each other. And so they're building all this angst and energy, negative energy around something that actually so this is all, what I kind of take from this is that, and I wish I could do Rolf's commentary justice here, because he's been sharing lots of observations that frankly I have a hard time framing into a question. But the reason I said the city versus country is, there is the development over the last 50 years of a globalist class, a tribe. So, Rolf's, all of his commentary is around the role that tribe plays in our life, and you've touched on that throughout here. I wouldn't call it part of the solution. I would call it just the reality, in my view, is that the evolution of that class or that tribe means that I am more comfortable with someone like you, or like Stephen, or like Mike, or like Rolf, than I am with others. When you talk about, who's got my back, it's hard in an abstract world, as you point out, an abstract realm. Having said that, in my mind, it's been for some time those other people from around the world that think the same way, and behave the same way. And so I have a greater affinity for that. Is, you know, you are my peeps, and that is the reality that binds, you know. And I don't know how to put this in the right term, but I mean, you know, I come from a working class environment, and so I think it gives me at least license to say this, and that is most of the people where I grew up didn't spend their time having these kinds of conversations. So the people that have these kinds of conversations or who find them interesting tend to be in the cities. Um, and you know, the challenge for me has always been how to, in a world of tribes, how to make that the dominant tribe, and which is not to say the same thing that your objective is. I'd like to wrap this up if I can. Is there anything else that that you had left unsaid?
Lots of things I'd love to say, but I think the one thing I just want to respond to what you just said, because I think it's a really important piece. And it's repeating what I said at the beginning, which is all social change starts with us individually. And as much as it would be nice to reach out to the people that we think are completely opposite from us and sort of get them to see reason and stuff, we have to start with ourselves first, and we have to become much more attractive for other people to speak to. And we're not ever going to speak to everybody. We're never going to convert everybody. And that's not our job. Our job is to be part of the snowballs that are, you know, building and building and building everywhere, and really contribute to building this agile culture. And again, agile being explore, experiment, commercialize, and engage, and sort of doing that iteratively. And our role in that is making sure that process keeps going, that we're always asking questions and being open to being questioned. And that means that we need to really think about how we think. We need to think about how are we responding physiologically, feeling, and how do we leverage that? And how do we engage with other people so that we can have these conversations? Mm-hmm. And first, make ourselves ready, willing, and able to have those conversations. And then creating the conditions that hopefully will allow other people to become ready, willing, and able to have these conversations. And it really doesn't matter if this is conversations in a business context, social context, political context. It really doesn't matter, right? This is something across the board where we need to learn how to engage with other people, and everything starts with us.
Cool. Very I mean, really really interesting, and as you point out, something that we could talk much more about, and probably will before too long.
Excellent. So, thank you so much for, first of all, making this happen. You know, your initiative with Lex was fantastic. I think it really, you know, it really galvanized a lot of people and really started getting people talking about things and getting people to start thinking about what can they do. And I think with Boom, it's sort of the next iteration, and it also is really going to keep the conversation going and probably even foster it even more. So thanks for doing this work, Bob.
Well, thank you very much.
And thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for being part of the our initial experiment as I described it. Now that's a really nice segue. I have to say, I said I was going to give some thoughts on my thoughts on Ukraine and sort of the relevance of that to the Boom discussion, and so probably much to Stephen's chagrin, I actually wrote it down, so it's scripted.
What?
No, you're the straight guy here, Mike or Stephen. So anyway, you didn't think that. I shouldn't have said that. So anyway, but like all of you, I've been following the events in the Ukraine with great interest and even greater sadness. Almost certainly the Russians will be successful in defeating the Ukrainian defense forces on the battlefield and overthrowing the government and installing a puppet government, with the best case being that Zelensky and his administration flee to exile and avoid the kill teams looking for them as we speak in the streets of Kiev. Obviously, the worst case for he and Ukraine is much worse. Having said that, the Ukrainian people, if their history means anything at all, may well exact a terrible price on the Russians, with a growing resistance movement that may possibly spread to and destabilize Russia itself. For the world at large, the worst case is something that we haven't discussed seriously in 30 years, and that is the specter of nuclear war, which is something that Rolf has observed in the comments. I was surprised that Putin referred to his arsenal so early in the conflict. Some things don't need to be said, especially by alleged strongmen. I had expected him to refer to them only if he ran into difficulty, if his war didn't go as planned. I noticed that it did catch the BBC's attention in their coverage yesterday and this morning in Canada's Globe and Mail. All the pundits and experts are wondering what's next. Personally, I subscribe to the madman theory, that the cold calculation that Putin has been known for has been replaced by a profound belief in his own disinformation. The roid rage that he evidenced in his hour-long rant the other night was incredibly unnerving. I concede, though, that it might just be another Putin-esque ruse. Here's hoping. It may prove the case that he fails in Ukraine and that the sanctions work by squeezing the life out of the Russian economy, spreading discontent. If the Ukrainians and we do succeed, then an unprecedentedly narcissistic megalomaniac with nuclear weapons backed into a corner could very likely surprise us all with new nightmares. He more likely will win, or at least appear to win, and thus emboldened will threaten NATO itself and continue to test our resolve. There be nightmares in that direction too. One thing is certain, the so-called normal world, already ravaged and reshaped by COVID, is now beyond return. A new world faces us. Aside from being informed, I'm not sure there is much that I can or should do to help frame this particular moment in time. Many have observed that the power play we are witnessing on the part of all players is the last gasp of an old world order. In the days, weeks, and months ahead, we need to trust in our current leadership to steer us through whatever transpires, to trust that we come out the other side whole and secure. But never fucking again. That a country with an economy smaller than Canada's and just barely larger than Texas can so threaten and destabilize our world, and especially the democracies within, is simply unacceptable in the 21st century. It's farcically, tragically, absurdly silly. One thing Putin has done that might be considered positive is to bring into the open the very active war on democracy in which he is one of the leading, but not the only, generals. He is the principal and most expert agitator of a cohort bound by the adage, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." Moreover, they are not bound by ideology or ideals, but by a quest for naked power and the wealth and control that power brings. Their North Star is found in the perceived glories of the past, the wondrous, inclusive future that today appears possible to so many of us terrifies them. So a purposeful assault on the institutions and peoples of civil society is clearly underway, with the power and resources of nation states and of too many of the world's ultra-wealthy propelling it. And I posit they are winning. This happens at a time when we already were just recognizing that the many existential issues that we have not dealt with are all coming to a head simultaneously. Climate change, race, income inequality, realignment of labor markets, etc. All must be addressed, and in the very near future. Failure in any is simply not an option. So at a time when the world has just been ravaged by a pandemic, killing millions, debilitating many millions more, and likewise destabilizing our economies, when the world order is threatened by new power plays with outcomes unimaginable, and with all of the ordinary existential issues haunting us, it's reasonable to be pessimistic. But that would be wrong. There is more reason to look into our collective history and find glory for the inspiration to create a new world of wonder where all peoples look to the future and the infinite possibilities it holds for them and their children. There is a broadly humanist, globalist set of tenets that a majority of citizens and democracies implicitly agree with, even if they don't know of its existence. I believe most would agree that we need a transformation of society and all of its underlying institutions, one that is systemic and global. We all like to use the software update reference of 1.0 or 2.0 or 3.0. Well, I say we need humanity 5.0. Capitalism or whatever should replace it 5.0. Democracy 5.0. Race relations 5.0. Policing 5.0. You get it. But most importantly, we need leadership 5.0. Not because current leadership is bad-willed, incompetent, or corrupt, but simply because it's obviously not working. From the way we define leadership to who we consider leaders, what the role of leadership should be, who we develop or recruit for leadership, there is simply an obvious leadership insufficiency. I have argued that we have to assume that we have just 10 years to manage our way through these issues while under attack. And I have argued we have the tested roadmap to scale the solution, the civic movement needed to combat and prevail over the bad actors while simultaneously and successfully addressing all of the existential issues that demand our attention. That roadmap is to be found in the work of Leaders Expedition, the 4-year journey where nearly 1,000 members from over 35 countries invested 20,000 hours of time to the effort. While the outbreak of COVID led to the suspension of that work, the Boom podcast and these discussions are meant to elevate, leverage, and amplify that mission by provoking actionable discussions and challenging Boom Xers, especially to facilitating the solutions that result, to use their time, expertise, connections, etc. to make that 5.0 world. Most importantly, though, my mission here is to find the founding investors, donors, who likewise see a world of wonder as possible and within our grasp, and are willing to be the first to fund a civic movement with the scale, scope, and power needed to prevail. As you reflect on events this weekend, see through the pessimism and concern that is absolutely warranted, and look through to that world of wonder that can be, must be made real by 2035, and reflect on what you are prepared to do about it, to assure that in 20 years the tragedy of Ukraine can never, ever, ever be repeated and visited on any nation. It's not naive, it's not a dream, it's not a fantasy, it can be. So check out our website at boombigideas.com and check out our mission and core assumptions tabs at the top. If that interests you, click on the Lex Archive to see more information on Leaders Expedition. In the meantime, if this mission or content resonates, please spread our links far and wide. And that is the end of my ego piece where I get to read what I want because it's my podcast. So anyway, this has been great. Ending on that note is appropriate in as much as that I did want to just speak to our next podcast guest, who, as I say, I'm hoping, Stephen, do you think we'll get that posted next week?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
From hell or high water.
Hell or high water. There, you heard it right from the producer's mouth. Our next guest is Olga Lautman, who is a senior fellow at the Center for European Studies, and these days is a frequent guest on BBC's Ukraine coverage. Her big idea is that bad actors, again, very timely, bad actors are using the strategies and tactics of hybrid warfare on democracy. We need to do the same to them. Her call to action is not what you think it would be. If you want to learn, you're gonna have to actually listen. So find us and listen to it. But she's worth it. And the other thing is the pipeline has been dry for the last few weeks, and there was a little bit of a hiccup, self-imposed by me, on recruiting of new speakers. We have lots of people working with Stephen and I over the next few weeks. So we actually have about the next 10 sessions lined up. And we got some really, really good speakers coming on of the caliber of Catarina and Mike and Stephen. So really looking forward to having them on. And I think it's going to become clearer and clearer sort of what the show's going to wind up looking like. So any final comments, Stephen? Now that I'm 4 minutes over.
Just that you're 4 minutes over, and it's an honor to work with you, Bob, and great meeting you, Catarina.
Well, thank you very much. Likewise to both. The comments, and again, I am going to introduce Rolf and Catarina. I think you guys would get along well. And Catarina, I'll make sure you get Rolf's comments off the chat here. And I think that's about it. So it's a wrap. Next time we will end at exactly 2:00. And thank you very much, everybody, for helping make this a great first time. And notably, Rolf and David Guthrow, who are asking excellent questions and making excellent points. So good day.